MTP 202 Tie and Dye. Unit 3 Knotting. One of the easiest and quickest ways of producing a dyed texture is to tie a length of cloth into knots. This can be tied in several ways depending on the size, shape, and grain of the cloth. Students will study about various ways of creating designs and textures with the help of different knotting techniques. Objectives. After completing this unit, you will be able to understand knotting in tie-dyeing technique, types of various effects produced by knotting technique, various methods of knotting technique. Introduction. Fine fabrics such as muslin, butter muslin, lawn, cambric, georgette, voile, silk, and nylon are ideal for this technique. Coarse-grained, bulky fabric is unsuitable. Knotting may be operated in three ways. They are a length of cloth tied into knots, a square, rectangle, or triangle of cloth knotted, knots tied in a length of cloth to form an all-over pattern. Knotting on a length of cloth. A strip of fine cloth is best. The wider and coarser it is, the fewer the knots. The most interesting texture is obtained from smaller knots rather than larger ones. Method. It is necessary, first of all, to make a test knob at one end of the sample to see how much cloth it takes up. After tying, make a crease or mark just beyond it. Untie the knot and measure the distance between the mark or crease and the end of the cloth. It can now be estimated how many knots to tie on the sample. Rule a pencil line across the cloth where the center of each knot is planned. Tie the knots in the middle of the sample first and then work outwards. Immerse the cloth in the dye for a short time. Rinse and dry. Twist the cloth into a roll and tie a knot at each pencil line. Tighten up the knots by manipulating the fabric until they are reasonably uniform in size. Knotting technique is improved by a second or third dyeing as the texture builds up and acquire form. This applies to all three types of knotting. The sample should be dry before untying is attempted. A blunt object may be used to loosen the nuts. On no account should a sharp metal points of scissors be used for this. Otherwise, the sample will develop numerous holes and tears. The untying may take some time, but if the knots are manipulated between the thumb and forefingers, they will gradually slacken. Repeat the whole process of knotting before dyeing the second color. Arranging the next lot of knots in exactly the same position as the previous ones. Self-check questions. This is the first set of your self-check questions. What are the different ways of knotting? Question number 2. What type of objects should be used for untying? If you have discussed these 2 questions, let us continue. A square, rectangle, or triangle knotting. Method: square or rectangle knotting. Pick up a point of cloth in the middle of the sample. Smooth it down in the left hand. Twist and curling it until a knot can be tied. Dye. Tie each of the corners into 3 or 4 smaller knots. Rinse, dry thoroughly, and untie. Repeat the knotting process, placing the second knot in the same position as the first. Dye a second color, rinse, dry, and untie. Repeat the whole process for a third color. As an alternative to the above grouping of knots, omit the large central one and just knot each corner several times or fold diagonally. Triangle. The main knot can be fixed at the apex or at the center of one of the sides of the triangle, and then the third pointed corners tied into 2, 3, or 4 knots. Alternatively, the 3 points of the triangle only need to be knotted, leaving the center patterned or the triangle folded in half. are small 3 samples of each type of knotting, that is square, rectangle and triangle. Knotting to form an all-over design. Fabric of the finest weave is essential for this type of knotting. Method. Make a test to estimate the area of fabric required to tie one knot. It is then possible to decide on the layout of the pattern. When this has been worked out, put a pencil dot in the cloth to indicate the center of each knot. Pick up a point of cloth at each dot and smooth it between the thumb and finger. Pull the warp and the weft of the fabric so that the knot is made in a nice way. Curl it around and tie into a knot. To tighten up each knot, hold the little knot in the middle while sliding the fabric towards it. When the knotting has been completed, dye, rinse and dry thoroughly. Untie and retie before dyeing another color. Variations. The individual knots or tufts may be dipped in a color different from that of the background. This way of tying up the cloth produces a circular, multicolored patch of texture. To ring the changes, some of the knots may be tied as follows, producing a diamond shape. Self-check question. This is the third question of the day today. Which variations are used to produce knotted pattern? If you have answered or discussed this question, let us continue. Method. Mark the position of knots. Crease the fabric lengthwise for several inches on each side of the dart, parallel to the selvage. Pick up the folded edge of cloth at the pencil dart and smoothen it firmly into a long pointed cone, giving an extra pull where the fabric is on the cross. Curl it round and tie into a knot. Tighten this into a hard, firm knob. Rinse and dry and then untie. When retying for another color, repeat the round knots and diamond knots in their respective positions. The pattern is more interesting when both shapes are incorporated. The areas of textures produced by one knot can be made larger by adjusting the size of the bunch of cloth, which projects from the center like an ear. A bigger tuft and a loose knot give a bold pattern, and vice versa. When very fine fabric is used, the central tuft can be so elongated that it is possible to tie another smaller knot beyond the first, making a double deck effect. The smaller one can be dyed a different color from the larger ones. Before finally untying, the knot can all be gathered into a cluster and held outside the dye bath while the background is dyed a different color. Tying up alternate knots only may make another variation. Dye, rinse, but do not untie. Tie the remaining knots and dye the second color. Rinse and dry. Untie all the knots. When working with the knotting technique, one may find the untying a little difficult. In this case, leave the knots and reinforce them with binding to create a satisfactory resist. Then wet out the sample before dyeing. Sometimes it is easier to untie the knot while the sample is immersed in water. But first, rinse thoroughly. Another way to untying is to twist the cloth emerging from either side of the knot back into it, as if turning a screw. This should be done when the sample is dry. Summing up, the dyeing is the process of dyeing a fabric in various patterns by covering certain areas before they come into contact with the dyes. Tying off the areas to be covered is the best way to achieve the effect. Through the use of various knots and tying techniques, the final pattern can be conceived and designed. Possible answers to the self-check questions. The answer to your first question is knotting may be operated in 3 different ways, that is, a length of cloth tied into knots, a square, rectangle or triangle of cloth knotted, knots tied in a length of cloth to form an all-over pattern. The answer to the second question was a blunt-ended object may be used to loosen and open up the knots. Sharp metal points of scissors should not be used for this purpose. Otherwise, the sample will develop numerous holes and tears. The answer to the third question of the day today was, following are the variations. The individual knots or tufts may be dipped in a color different from that of the background. This way of tying up the cloth produces a circular multicolored patch of texture. To ring the changes, some of the knots may be tied as follows, producing a diamond shape. Terminal questions. What do you understand by knotting in tie-dyeing technique? Question number 2. Discuss different types of effects produced by knotting technique. We come to the end of today's lesson. I hope now you're going to try out the different techniques of knotting and make excellent samples. Thank you.